and some context on this story. My guest, Solomon Friedman, he's standing by in our studios in Ottawa. He's a criminal defense lawyer. And I want to get, if I can, first of all, your reaction to the Auditor General's report, Solomon.
You know, this is obviously a very wide-reaching report, a very detailed report that really looked at the Senate expenses from the ground up. What remains to be seen is what are the criminal law implications, whether or not the RCMP will indeed press charges, whether these individuals will be prosecuted. But there's no doubt that this is a scathing indictment of a legislative body with, at the time of the report at least, with very limited oversight in terms of spending and expenditures. We
heard from these top three senators coming out, mounting a defense, saying, listen, we've made changes. This was a snapshot from 2011 and 2012. We now have more transparency. We now have greater oversight. We're going to look at this. And I want to know what you thought from what they had to say. What jumped out for you?
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, we have these kind of parallel proceedings. You know, on one hand, all eyes are on the Ottawa courthouse where suspended Senator Mike Duffy is going on trial for much of the very same sort of allegations that we saw throughout the Auditor General's report. And on the other hand, we have the Auditor General who's made some findings, some conclusions and recommendations. So what's very interesting here is whether or not at any point the RCMP or the prosecution will ever be able to prove that there was a fraudulent intent. And that's where, when we hear these prominent senators talking about the rules as they existed at the time or the Senate process, what that really is speaking to is this issue of, you know, the senators may have been negligent or they may have been following a process that wasn't transparent, that shouldn't be acceptable to Canadians. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's criminal intent or that there could be criminal liability in terms of the RCMP's ultimate investigation.
You know, that is a great point. I just want to dig a little bit deeper here while I've got you here, because you are a criminal defense lawyer. So we're talking about things like travel expenses that were flagged as being inappropriate, or residency issues being inappropriate, or using expenses for personal travel, paying for staff when you're not supposed to, that kind of thing. But again, it's trying to prove that that was fraudulent, that that was criminal, as opposed to the rules being so vague, so unclear, that everybody was doing it, or there were no real sort of black and white rules in place to say, hey, you cannot do this, you cannot charge for that.
You know, something very interesting that jumped out at me is that a core part of the prosecution against Mike Duffy is that when he claimed to be on Senate business, he was really on partisan business. The Auditor General doesn't seem to make that distinction. It's very clear in his report that he considers partisan business to be part of the senator's business as a parliamentarian. But this shows that discrepancy between, you know, the Auditor General has a certain idea about what the rules are and what the standards ought to be for transparency and accountability, and the prosecution might have a very different one. So I think before jumping to any conclusion that all those recommended to the RCMP will face charges, I think, you know, a competent investigator is going to have to dig deeper. And certainly before a prosecutor thinks about putting this before the courts, he or she has to determine, is this an issue of, you know, some sort of lapses in rules or some sort of poor rulemaking on the Senate's behalf, or is this an individual who had criminal intent that needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to act dishonestly or for a fraudulent purpose? Those are two completely different things.
Right, but what role does just pure common sense play in all this? For example, I'll give you a scenario. If I live in a province for 4 weeks out of the year, is that really my primary residence if the other 11 months of the year I'm living in Ottawa?
You know, that's a very interesting question, and you know, Mike Duffy's a great example of that. You know, we hear that Mike Duffy didn't really have a residence in PEI. He had a non-winterized cottage where he spent very limited amount of time. There wasn't even snow removal done, we've been told. But imagine this scenario. The prosecutor has asserted that Mike Duffy was never a resident of PEI at all for the purpose of being appointed to the Senate. So I can imagine a senator saying, hold on a second, you're going to say that I live in Ottawa, this is my primary residence. But according to the Constitution, in order for me to be eligible to be appointed to the Senate, I need to be a resident of the province of appointment. And no less authority than the Prime Minister has told me that I indeed am a resident of that province because he's appointed me to the Senate of Canada. So here we see this interplay between the constitutional definition of resident and the Senate definition of primary residence. So, you know, common sense certainly does come into play, but the issue is, you know, are these definitions that overlap? Or, you know, can a senator rely and say, I was appointed to the Senate of Canada as a senator for a certain province. That's my province of residence.
It starts to get a little mind-numbing at one point as you're trying to figure out what is and isn't kosher, so to speak. How do you think this plays out now?
Well, it's very interesting. There's two things to watch with this report. The first one is, what does the RCMP ultimately do, and how does the criminal process, if any, evolve for the named senators? The second thing is, how does this affect the ongoing prosecutions? Because if you read the Auditor General's report, you see that there's quite a bit of conduct that's alleged to be criminal on the part of Mike Duffy that falls into that category of senators who are in the group of 21 who are not being referred to the RCMP for investigation. And I know, Mike Duffy's lawyer, Don Bain, is sure to point to that and say, how can you find my client guilty beyond a reasonable doubt when even the Auditor General, who certainly has been extremely zealous and meticulous in this investigation, didn't feel that that type of conduct was criminal enough to warrant RCMP investigation. But at the same time, we're going to see the interplay between the arbitration of Justice Binney. He's going to need to make legal determinations. He's going to need to decide what primary residence means. And of course, Justice Valancourt in the Ontario Court of Justice is going to be deciding those very same issues when it comes to suspended Senator Mike Duffy. Are they going to reach the same conclusions? That they don't need to. If you want to talk about mind numbing, this is they can take absolutely divergent paths. And I suspect that these are issues that will not be resolved for a matter of years.
Which means what exactly?
Well, it means depending which way Mike Duffy's trial goes, it could be tied up in appeals. The other issue is, what happens when the senators don't agree with former Supreme Court Justice Binney's findings in arbitration? This could be a matter that's not confined to the Senate, but can go out to judicial review, and there could be courts involved in deciding these issues for a long time to come. So I think the issue of the Auditor General's recommendations in terms of oversight going forward, are one thing, but the core matter needs to be dealt with. Did the senators who are impugned in this group of 9 commit criminal offenses, or are they guilty of nothing more than simply either poorly following rules or following poor rules? One or the other. Both those things don't generally constitute criminal conduct. But it would be very interesting to see, first of all, does the RCMP even accept these investigations in terms of looking at them in detail? And if they do, where do they ultimately go from there?
Solomon Friedman in Ottawa, helping us try to make sense of all of this information coming in. Great to have you on the program. Thanks for this, Solomon.
My pleasure.